recording. But welcome to this August 31st meeting of the Lake Hickory Rotary. For our invocation, I believe we have Maurice Capps set to do that today.
That's correct.
All right, good.
You
All right,
ready
thank
for
you,
it?
Maurice.
Okay. Let us bow our heads, please. Our most gracious Heavenly Father, for this day and all the many days that you've blessed us, we give you thanks. We ask you to provide comfort for all those families that have lost loved ones in Afghanistan, that are suffering from the hurricane in Louisiana and from the floods in North Carolina and Tennessee. Grant us the wisdom and the strength to uphold the four-way test and be sensitive to the needs of others. And may each of us in our daily routine come to know the joy of caring and sharing with others, not as fortunate as we are. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Maurice. All right. All right. Now we'll do the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you all. Sorry. All right, let's move on. We have some announcements, I believe. So one announcement for our club is we'd kind of is a COVID-19 update. Our board did meet yesterday, or not yesterday, last week on Thursday. And what we decided to do moving forward for the month of September, or at least the first couple weeks of September, is we're going to have a Zoom option and then also meet outside at Highland Recreation Center or at Stanford Park, the Stanford Park Picnic Shelter near Highland Recreation Center. I have that reserved through Mark Seaman. Thank you to that fellow Rotarian Mark Seaman getting that arranged for us. But we will be able to have kind of a hybrid option that's not just an inside meal type option. So it's not ideal. It's not where we want to be at this point, but we still will be offering the Zoom. We'll broadcast that via Zoom. It'll be the same Zoom link again that we've been using for the last pretty much year and a half to keep that consistent and make it easy so that you guys can save that as an invite or anything like that. And then we'll just kind of meet out and have some fellowship at the picnic shelter there at Stanford Park at Highland Avenue. In the newsletter and in the announcements, I'll give you the information about it, but it's 1451 8th Street Drive Northeast, if you're not familiar with where Highland Recreation Center is. And it's just in the back, kind of near the basketball court past the skate park out there. It's a decent size little picnic shelter.
David,
and then,
David,
yes,
David,
sir.
are we, if you're going to meet in person out there, are we going to brown bag? I can't remember.
Oh yes, sorry. Yes, we're just gonna brown bag food for now. If we stick with that option for a little longer, then we may have some other options out there. But right now, yeah, just brown bag the food, and we'll meet you out there. Then just remember to send me any stories or updates of interest for the newsletter. I didn't do it this weekend just kind of because I wanted to finalize some of these details, and I'll send out a newsletter after this meeting today or tomorrow morning. The other announcement, John Hall, if you have a quick second to just give us an update on the event that we had out at the Crawdad Stadium, and then the kind of follow-up to that you mentioned this morning.
Okay. Just quick bullets on the event Saturday. The biggest bullet, I guess, is amazing. We had, by my count, 110 participants. We had at least another 100+ family and probably close to that many Rotarians. So right at 300 folks there. I will tell you, it was a little bit hot throughout that event, but it was absolutely tremendous to help these kids and their families and hear their stories and just be blessed by them was wonderful. And we really, really appreciate your help and all the other Rotary clubs that participated. Now we've got an opportunity to make this even better to close it out. We had planned from the beginning to bring these families back for a Crawdads game next Tuesday, September the 7th, which we're going to do. And we're providing each participant with 3 tickets for themselves and some others they bring with them. But Douglas Lucasio has come up with another twist, which is great. We would love to turn out as many Rotarians as possible to attend that game and honor these kids and celebrate them. So what we're going to do is, if you will buy your ticket for that game at the ticket window and use the password Rotary, Douglas is going to sell you a discounted $6 ticket. But the real plus is he's going to donate half the money to Polio Plus. So we can honor these families and we can contribute to Polio Plus. And that's a great end to a really fine project.
All right, thank you for that, John, and thank you for a great event out at the stadium there. Next, Ingrid is going to talk a little bit. This is the segment that we do kind of each week via Zoom called Rotary Connections, where we just kind of go into breakout rooms for a couple minutes and to try to kind of create that fellowship that we're kind of missing via Zoom. So Ingrid.
Thanks, Dave. So, yep, I'm stepping in for Lindsay Kiesler again today. So glad to see everyone here on Zoom today. There are events that happen in our lives that seemingly make the world stop. So while I was not alive when Pearl Harbor was bombed, I know that my grandmother was eating butter pecan ice cream when that happened, because that's her memory that she shared with me. She knew exactly what she was doing when that happened. And another event that is relevant to today's program that particularly had an impact on millennials is the attack on September 11th, 2001. So we would like for today's question to be, where were you on September 11th, 2001? So we're going to go into breakout rooms and you'll have about, oh, are you doing it, Dave?
Yeah, I've got the breakout rooms ready to go as soon as you're ready. Sorry.
Yeah. Today's question, where were you on September 11th, 2001?
9:30 in the morning or something like that.
I'm going to create these and open them up and take about probably, I think there'll be about 5 of you in each room. So we can come back here in about 5 to 8 minutes or so.
I've seen it on TV. Oh,
You enjoying?
so I must have been home.
Looks like we have everybody. Looks like we have everybody back in the meeting. Thanks. That was so. I guess Ingrid, if you want to continue kind of with the way we debrief from that.
Yes. So please share if you've got something in your group that was particularly impactful. You can just type it there in the chat so we can all see it. Our group had some, it was mostly just the discussion about how emotional of a day it was. Some people didn't remember exactly where they were at that moment, but they remember the day and turning on the TV, and it seemed like everybody's eyes were glued to the TV that day. So those were some things in my group, but yeah, share those in the chat if you'd like. And, I think it was an interesting question to discuss, a lot more emotional. Most of our discussions have been a little bit more lighthearted, but this one was certainly appropriate leading into today's program.
Thanks, Ingrid. moving on to our program, find Jim. Jim Carell has our program today, and he is going to introduce our speaker, Mr. Alex Zerden. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. And hopefully all of you have had an opportunity to peruse Alex's bio. I won't spend a lot of time on that, but we're honored, Alex, to have you with us today. He's been in the news the last couple of weeks nationally. He's been on Fox Business News. As a matter of fact, we saw that a couple of days ago. And he's been obviously written up in the New York Times and the Washington Post and numerous other media publications. And he's a native of Savannah, Georgia, and he's went to Tufts University, and he has a fantastic career already. I mean, he served in the White House with the Treasury Department. And 2 years he served as the attaché for the Treasury Department in Afghanistan, in Kabul. And with that, Alex, it's just so timely and so interesting that you've been able to work with us and be on today. So with that, and without further ado, please welcome our nephew, Alex Zerden.
Jim, thank you so much for the introduction, and David and the entire Rotary community. Thank you all for having me today. Also proud family lineage in Hickory. My family has been involved with Zerden store for close to 100 years, and we have a real love for the community in Hickory, and I always love visiting. And so I really appreciate the platform and the chance to speak with you all about my experiences in Afghanistan, kind of what we're all seeing and living through on the news over the past couple of weeks and the tragic events. So happy to talk about that. I'm just going to give a couple of minutes of introductions, but then really want to open this up to you and to the Rotary community here to discuss and answer your questions and any concerns you have or anything that you find interesting, because I've got a lot to share, but I really want to listen and understand what is on your minds. And so to begin, by way of background, as Jimmy mentioned, I've been working in a couple of really great opportunities, really great jobs. My first job actually out of college was helping to represent US international victims of terrorism, including the 9/11 victims, to actually sue terrorists. So this is kind of a crazy idea or crazy legal theory at the time after 9/11, but they've been incredibly successful in trying to find justice for these families and provide some level of closure and also financial compensation when, you know, it's hard to put people in jail. It's hard to really go after some of the worst people around the world. You know, there's a way to hold them accountable and to follow the money to do that. And so I've spent my career in that same vein. So I worked in Congress, I worked in the Senate, and then I worked for a prosecutor as well, doing financial investigations, doing financial crimes cases, and working on counterterrorism financing in the government and in the private sector. So as Jimmy mentioned, I had the opportunity to deploy to Kabul. I was there in 2018 and 2019, and I ran the US Treasury Department's office. And just kind of ground rules, you know, I'm speaking in a personal capacity. I'm not part of the US government anymore. I run a small consulting company right now. So these are my reflections and my views, my own. And so, yeah, I just want to make sure that that's pretty clear that I'm only speaking for myself right now. And so with that, you know, the opportunity to deploy to Afghanistan was really a once in a lifetime and obviously something that is not possible right now. And so I wanted to serve abroad. I was really intrigued to be a diplomat. And so what that meant was that I had to leave home in Washington, DC at the time and move halfway around the world into this little compound in downtown Kabul, surrounded by a lot of security in a very, very violent and chaotic place. I mean, Kabul was subject to a lot of violence. There was an active insurgency by the Taliban at the time. ISIS-K was very active there. And the types of suicide bombing, or the suicide bombing we saw the other day that tragically killed 13 Marines and over 160 Afghans and another Navy corpsman, as well as a member of Special Forces, these were relatively common. They weren't every day, but these types of attacks, these complex attacks, these really violent attacks were going on in Kabul as well as around the country for almost 2 decades. And they had picked up over the past several years. So the violence we're seeing, the chaos we're seeing, this was kind of my normal. It was way worse for Afghans on the street. You know, I lived behind security barriers. I had a lot of security protection, both static security, so people around our compound who secured it, as well as whenever I moved around the city or around the country, I had a number of security officers who were there to protect me. And I'm grateful for their protection. And a really fascinating statistic was that no US diplomats were killed or injured under US diplomatic protection in the past 20 years in Afghanistan. That's a pretty remarkable statistic. Again, thousands of US soldiers were killed, thousands of contractors were killed, tens of thousands of Afghans died, and a number of US diplomats were killed, but they were not under diplomatic security. They were either with the military or other government assets and other government security. And so I'm really grateful for their security and for that protection they provided to allow me to do the business of diplomacy. So I was an economic diplomat. I worked to help preserve and prop up the Afghan economy. So to work with the central bank governor, the Ministry of Finance and the finance minister, their deputies and their subordinates, as well as other parts of the Afghan government, the Afghan military, and other partners. I worked a lot with the international community, so our NATO partners. Almost over 1,000 NATO soldiers died in the mission over the past 20 years. And they are there because of the collective defense, the pact, the treaty that NATO has among allied countries. And so that they're there and they're dying because they're there to support the United States in our response to the 9/11 attacks. And that's really remarkable and really incredible. And I don't think I fully appreciated that, the international sacrifice and the international commitment that was there from our partners around the world and our friends and allies. And then the other side is I worked a lot with the US government. So I was the ambassador's primary economic, banking, and finance advisor. I worked with the General Scott Miller, who was the 4-star commander. He was a former Delta Force commander who was on the Black Hawk Down raid and Black Hawk Down response in Somalia in the 1990s. Really incredible leader. And so I was able to work with him and provide he and his team with advice and recommendations on the status of the Afghan economy and a whole host of other issues. And so I lived on this compound and I worked every day to protect US national security interests, to work on counterterrorism issues against the Taliban, against Al-Qaeda, against ISIS-K, and also on the more positive side to help prop up the Afghan economy, to help grow it a little bit, make it just a little bit better. The economy is heavily dependent on international donor assistance. So American taxpayers and a lot of wealthy countries around the world help pay for the Afghan government's budget and help the Afghan people. And they need it. 90% of the country, about 35 million people, live on $2 a day or less. The level of poverty in the country is extreme. And I barely got to see a glimpse of that just because I was in the cities for the most part. But the rural parts of the country are in really rough shape, despite a lot of gains made over the past several years. And so that's kind of in a nutshell what I was doing there. I'm happy to talk about my experiences on the ground, happy to talk about what happens next. Again, I was there in the Trump administration. I worked in the White House in the Obama administration. I see myself as a public servant, as a national security professional and a banking and financial regulatory professional. And so happy to talk more about other issues, other challenges, but again, want to focus on kind of these public service issues and happy not to talk about anything kind of political in nature.
Thank you so much, Alex. I believe if anybody has questions, you can feel free to kind of put them in the chat or unmute yourself. Either one works. But I think John King had a question there. I don't know if you can read that, Alex, or you want me to? You got it.
Yeah, no, great question. So John asked what the primary economic resources will allow the government to survive, the Afghan government. Are other countries sending financial support? Those are two great questions. I don't have great answers for them. So what the economy does rely on, and I didn't touch on this as much, But Afghanistan is the largest producer of heroin in the world. So about 80% of the world's heroin is cultivated and exported out of Afghanistan, which is really bad. But that's effectively, it's the only thing that they meaningfully export. They export some other food products, some other crops, but the main thing is heroin. And that's bad. That's bad for the world. That's bad. That heroin hits a lot of markets around the world, countries we don't love like Iran and Pakistan, but it hits the streets of Europe too and hurts our allies. And so that's a really big global problem that we need to address, because right now that's the only way that they can meaningfully make money. So they, to get money to come in the country, to help their government with their budget, to help the people on the ground, they need something, they need to produce something for the world. And right now it's just heroin, and sadly also methamphetamines are picking up in their popularity for export. And so kind of how the international community can respond, it's also really hard because the Taliban is subject to US and UN and international sanctions, economic sanctions. So for today, it's illegal for me and everyone else on this call right now to send money to the Taliban. So even if we wanted to help and go through the Taliban, we would be violating US law and subject to criminal prosecution if we did that. So, and think about that on steroids. If you're a US charity that wants to send relief in, and you want to send it through a bank in Afghanistan, well, now a third of the banks are state-owned banks. And so those banks themselves are owned by the Taliban and subject to sanctions. So it gets really hard very quickly to how to provide assistance, how to provide aid in the country. And I think the US government is committed to doing that. Yesterday, the Secretary of State said that US will provide aid and assistance to the Afghan people, but it will bypass the Taliban government. And that's the right approach. I mean, I don't think that there's much political daylight on that decision. It's just really, really hard to do that because the main way of getting aid into the country before 3 weeks ago, was through that Afghan government, which is now controlled by the Taliban. So Bill asked, and sorry if I'm jumping through questions. So John, we'll go back up to Floyd. What will happen to banking under the Taliban? So banking system in Afghanistan is relatively underused. So only about 1 in 10 Afghans have a bank account, and that number plummets to about 1 in 25 women. So about 3.8% of women have bank accounts, which is horrible for a range of economic and social reasons I'm happy to talk about. But the banking system is underutilized. It's gonna be a lot harder for banks to access, in Afghanistan, to access US dollars or access regional partners of the international financial system now that the Taliban is in control. What they do use is this system called hawalas, which is this traditional H-A-W-A-L-A-S, means transfer in Arabic. And it's this very old school Western Union or MoneyGram system where I show up where I am right now, and if I want to send Jim $10, I don't have a relationship directly with Jim. And so I go to my agent in my town and sends money to agent in Hickory to get that money to Jim. And over time, they're sending money back and forth. So a lot of it offsets. So you don't have to move money across borders or on roads that are often very unsafe and unsecure. And so it's a very simple and elegant way to move money. The problem is it's also really great for terrorism financing, for drug trafficking, for tax evasion, for a lot of bad things, because there isn't a lot of regulation or oversight of the industry. And so I'm worried that that's going to increase in popularity now the Taliban is in control. This is their banking system. This is what they're familiar with. They're not, they've been subject to sanctions. They've been really marginalized in a good way from the international financial system. And so their interactions with banking services is actually through the hawala system. So I suspect that's going to increase in popularity, but also cause, again, huge problems because ISIS-K loves to use it. The Taliban, Al-Qaeda, everybody likes to use it because it's so easy and it's not quite anonymous, but it's relatively low levels of supervision. So the next question, how China fits in the gap. How can this work with Islamic jihadists while China is ethnically cleansing the Muslim Uyghurs? From John. Great question as well. So the China question is really thorny. I think a lot of people are asking that same question, both in the US government, around the world. And not a lot of people have good answers. So China has a border with Afghanistan. They share a small land border. To international jihadist movements and international extremist movements, that you can defeat a big country, you can defeat a superpower, and that they're not untouchable. So I'm worried about two parts of that. One, instability in other parts of the world where there are jihadist movements or other extremist movements. Now seeing the success of the Taliban in kicking the US out, we're getting dollars in funding to the Afghan government. Probably not. That's a lot of money. And they don't love the Taliban. I think they are having a line of diplomatic communication. Taliban leaders have gone to Beijing, they've gone to Moscow, but I don't think they love them that much. They're just going to pony up, which is a large amount of cash without any strings attached, without any insight into how that money is used. Because again, that money could go right back into Western China and support extremists there, and support other actors of instability around the world. So China has to be really cautious about it. Also talk about China helping to extract minerals from Afghanistan. Also a possibility, but Afghanistan is landlocked. It's in mountains. It's surrounded by really bad. And so it could happen, but it's just going to take a long time and very unclear what's going to happen in between. Bill asked, did other family go with you? Did I learn other languages? How much graft corruption siphoned off our financial assistance? So I was unaccompanied, so I went by myself. Most people there went by themselves. There were a handful of diplomats that were able to take a spouse, either because that spouse was also a diplomat, or they were able to work in a certain job series, not as a diplomat, but work on compound that had to be hired by an American or had to be staffed as an American. And so you create a lot of community on the compound. I have some incredible friends. It's a mix of, I explained it as a little bit of being on a cruise ship, being in a minimum security prison, being on a small college campus, and being in a summer camp. And depending on the hour of the day, it feels more like one than the other. So you're kind of locked on this compound for weeks or months at a time without being able to leave for many of the people on the compound. And so you have to develop community and kind of meeting these strangers who are your friends and who are your colleagues as well. And so I think we did a pretty good job of improving morale and welfare and just making sure that we were looking after each other, people's mental health, people's physical health. And then also, on the positive side, having fun. I mean, so there were a lot of events that we would schedule, social events, entertainment. There was, trivia night, and there was a movie night. And so we tried to do stuff to make things a little bit more enjoyable. We had pretty good food on compound. So that was nice that, I think I gained probably about 15 or 20 pounds from eating pretty hearty food. And, so you try to make the best of the experience. On the other side of it, I didn't learn local languages. So they speak two primary languages in the country. One is similar to what's spoken in Iran, and the other one is just local to Eastern Afghanistan and Western Pakistan. It costs a lot of money for the US government to train someone to learn languages. Some people within the State Department and military and others were sent to language training. But because I dealt with mostly government officials and dealt mostly with more sophisticated business contacts, like a CEO of banks or head of large conglomerates, they ended up actually speaking English better than I did. They were educated, if not, in some of the best schools in Afghanistan, in the US or England or elsewhere. And so it wasn't really necessary for me to have local language experience, but it would have been an asset, but I didn't need it. And almost all of my meetings were in English. And when we needed interpreter services, we had those on the embassy compound. And so we were able to access those. The corruption issues is really massive. So the US has invested $83 billion in direct military assistance, tens of other billions of dollars in development assistance, humanitarian assistance. And there are real concerns and a lot of documentation about the level of corruption in the Afghan government. And so that's something that was very real. That was something I directly encountered every day when I was in Afghanistan, and something that definitely undermined US government efforts in foreign policy and national security objectives in Afghanistan. We were often our own worst enemies. So there was documentation as far back as I think 2009 that to get fuel to the military, we had to get it through Pakistan. And we would hire a logistics company, the US government. The logistics company, the shipping company, these truckers would then pay off Taliban and other warlords not to blow up their trucks. And so what we were doing was protecting our trucks to get to the war fighters and the soldiers in these bases who needed it. But at the same time, we were also paying for the Taliban to conduct their insurgency. And so there's no real way to win a war when you're funding both sides of it, fundamentally. And that's a small example, but I saw that on steroids. Or the other example was that we would provide all of the fuel to the Afghan military. And then the commanders would be so corrupt, they would divert the fuel and sell it on the black market. So not only were their soldiers not getting the fuel they needed, so their trucks would seize up, their helicopters couldn't fly. You're seeing all these effects of it. But then you were funding this black market that was likely being purchased fuel by the Taliban, ISIS-K, and others to fight, and kill Americans. And that's horrible. But there's a lot of reasons why corruption persisted. People are responding to economic incentives, and they're acting pretty rationally, unfortunately. And so that was the huge problem, is that we injected so much money into the country, into the government, and their ability to absorb that efficiently, effectively, was really minimal. And so it bred a lot of corruption, and we kept feeding it. It was almost like an addiction, and we kept feeding it. But the issue is that Congress appropriates the money, Defense Department, State Department, and others have to spend the money, and people are judged on how they spend the money, not how the money is being used. And so that's a really big problem. But this is kind of a function of how our democracy works, and kind of the real challenges of working in a conflict environment halfway around the world in a landlocked, impoverished country. The iPad says, this Afghan debacle has gone on for many, many decades. What hope is there that it will ever change? Right, so this conflict's been going on in different phases for 40 years. I mean, this is almost 2 generations of Afghans have been born into this, at least. It's tragic, it's horrible, and I don't see it getting better in the short term. But I'm an eternal optimist, and I think things can only get better. I don't know how much, and they can get worse in the immediate term on a humanitarian crisis. But the international community was very interested in Afghanistan when the Mujahideen were killing Soviets in the 1980s, and then we effectively, collectively turned our back to it, and that allowed for the Taliban to rise and provide safe haven to Al Qaeda. So I don't think we can perpetuate the attacks of 9/11. So I don't think we can completely ignore Afghanistan. I think we're going to be remain to be engaged from the United States, from also civil society, from American citizens who have a connection to this conflict and to this country. And then also, I think it is important, though, that we are reprioritizing our focus on China, our focus on Russia, from a bigger national security and foreign policy perspective. I think we can manage Afghanistan. I think we will manage Afghanistan. We just can't ignore Afghanistan. And I don't think we'll be able to do that. Catherine asked if I'm in communication with anyone trying to get out and not able to. Yes, and it's incredibly tragic, and I'm incredibly frustrated right now with the response. It's been impressive what the diplomats and what the soldiers and Marines did on the ground to evacuate well over 100,000 people under such short period of time. But I am concerned about the people who are still left. There's still such a huge number. We're not going to be able to get everybody out. There's 40 million people in the country. Even if a fraction of that want to get out and deserve to get out, that's still a massive undertaking. And so I think we're going to have to work in civil society, private donors, and the nonprofit world are really going to have to step up and help these people. The other major part is being good citizens here at home. I mean, what these people have been through, the ones who have made it through this horrific war, 40 years of violence, and have now made it to the United States because they were our allies, they were our people. They worked for the US military, they saved soldiers' lives. They worked for me at the embassy and helped protect us and help us fulfill our foreign policy and national security objectives there, and humanitarian objectives. We owe a debt to these people who are here now. And I think we need to have very open arms. And I know how this can get very quickly entangled in broader questions of immigration and broader, very thorny issues of politics. But these are humans who have worked incredibly hard and put their lives at risk, put their families' lives at risk to defend the United States. And we need to welcome them again with open arms and do whatever we can to help absorb them here and ensure their success here, that they're able to actually provide a better life for them and their families here. Which country will be the Taliban's first contact to sell our left behind assets? That's a great question. So some of it's ours. I think the pictures of the helicopters at the airport is a little bit of a false thing. I've been on those helicopters for the State Department and the State Department ones that are pictured on the news. Those are 1960s and 1970s airframes. I was terrified to fly in them. I was told they were safe, and they were safe. They got me to where I needed to go. But the decision to render them inoperable and leave them down, I think that's totally the right decision. We didn't need to take out these really, really old airframes. The question about other military assets that the US has provided to the Afghan government that is now in the hands of the Taliban, I'm worried about it. I'm sure there is a robust black market, both for countries and for non-state entities to buy these weapons. And so that is a really major area of concern. I don't think anybody expected the Afghan government and the military to collapse this quickly. And so this is one of those unintended consequences. Where they go, though, I'm not an arms dealer, fortunately.
I'm sure they'll go to the highest bidder.
Yeah, or but are there regional there are terrorist groups operating in Pakistan against both Pakistani and also Chinese interests. There are insurgent groups in eastern Iran. There's the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan in the north. So I mean, there's a lot of places that they can go, or they can stay in Afghanistan. I mean, they have there will be a need for a police and security force, and so they will put some of those weapons to use. But in terms of this fundamentally shaking up the global arms traffic and arms kind of supply, I'm not an expert on that. I'm just not too qualified to really expand on it more than what I've said.
Thank you.
Yep. But what was telling was one of the first calls, and the Economist reported this, was one of the first calls between Taliban leadership and a foreign delegation was the leader of Hamas. And so in the Gaza Strip. And so, the connection between Sunni militant groups is alive and well. And so again, I'm not suspecting that the Taliban is going to ship weapons to Hamas, but just the amount of connectivity between these groups is only going to get stronger. And then what do you think will happen with Pakistan? It's always been an issue. Does this make it worse, better? Same from David. Pakistan keeps me up at night. Pakistan has been a terrible partner. They have been talking out of both sides of their mouth for more than 2 decades, for the better part of this entire conflict over the past 4 decades. They supplied the most extreme of the extreme groups in Afghanistan in the 80s and 90s and supported the Taliban's rise. They supported the Taliban in the 2000s and 2010s. I think they are really, really a bad actor in the region and have undermined US efforts in the region for decades now. They also have a real economy. They also have nuclear weapons. So they're also friendly with China. And so they're not someone the US can push around as easily, but they need to get their house in order. And I think it's really terrible, their behavior, and I think they do need to improve it. And it's just really a question of what tools the US government has and the international partners have to improve Pakistan's behavior, both on its own as well as with Afghanistan. Are there other questions?
Well, on behalf of the, if there are no more questions, on behalf of the.
Yeah, David, or actually, I'm happy to share a funny story, like some of the lighter stuff,
Sure.
I guess. Because to end on not a positive note, but just something a little bit funnier. So before I deployed, I did about 5 days of training run by the State Department about how to work in a high risk environment and kind of security and defensive training things. And so we did basic combat medicines, how to put on a tourniquet. We did, but also a full day of defensive driving. And so this is important, and it was really cool. There's a racetrack in the middle of West Virginia that we got to drive on and drive Crown Vics and Suburbans, and just really great learning experience on how to drive defensively. We crashed cars, and I can share with Jimmy, I've sent it to him, but there's a CNN clip about this pre-deployment training. And so I was really excited about it, but then it kind of dawned on me midway through my defensive driving training, so a fifth of my entire training, that if I have to drive in Afghanistan, that means that my security is compromised, that I had security with me the whole time, and I was being driven everywhere I went. I couldn't even open up the door to my armored car because they had to hold it for me because of their protocols. And so it was just kind of like a little bit crazy that I did this defensive driving training, because if I had to drive, that would have been, it was a really, really bad day. So fortunately in Afghanistan, I never had to drive. And again, just that's a funny quirk of how government can work sometimes. And I passed my security training with flying colors, my defensive driving, but fortunately never put to use.
Alex, I have one more question.
Yeah, sure.
I typed it in, but it didn't come up. How many terrorist organizations exist, and how do they different ones evolve? And the second part of that is, do they cooperate with each other, or do they compete against each other? And how are they funded?
Yeah, great question. So I think we could probably talk on all that for a few hours, if not days or weeks. But I think on the short end, there are a number of terrorist groups operating in Afghanistan. I think the number is publicly in the low dozens, but please don't hold me to that. And the more instability that allows more terrorist groups to take root. I mean, Afghanistan a lot of the country is heavily mountainous. It's very remote parts. And so it allows people to kind of be left to their own devices and be left alone historically. And so that's what allows terrorist groups to organize there and to defend themselves there. They don't all love each other. So a lot of them are Sunni Islamic movements. But for instance, ISIS-K, which is the one that perpetrated the horrible attack against the airport last week, is an offshoot and a breakaway faction of Taliban. So they said they were former Taliban members who said the Taliban was too soft and too easy. And so they are even more hardcore. And the Taliban, ISIS-K, hate each other and they try to kill each other. And they've done that on multiple occasions. So there is some complexity to that. How they're funded, a big mix, so not monolithic. There are a lot of different ways. But the Taliban is funded by drug revenues, by taxation, by extortion, by kidnapping for ransom. And now they own the government. So they get customs revenue and they get possibly donor support, both individually and from charities around the world. And those funding streams are somewhat similar for different terrorist groups. And it just depends on their size and their scope. Illegal mining is a big issue that we talked about. And ISIS-K previously fundraised off of that. But so they have a lot of diverse revenue streams. They're like businesses. And that's, I think, the most useful way to think about them is that they are, some are more sophisticated than others, but they, the key to good businesses is you're diversified so that if one revenue stream gets shut down, you have others that you can use. And, also to store your money and to move it around. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. And so they have very smartly adapted over years to a little bit of a cat and mouse chase by the former Afghan government, by the US and international partners to try to deprive them of revenue and seize their money. So that's where we are right now. But they have assets, definitely have assets. Now the Taliban just has to spend a lot more to keep the government running.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. All right.
Alex, one other question.
Sure.
Could there have been more security, or the American soldiers being in place further for preventing any of the killings that did go on when the terrorist attack occurred?
That's a great question. I'm actually honestly surprised that more people weren't killed. Like if we're being honest about this, like the risks that the US Marines and the Navy and the Special Forces put themselves at was incredibly high. They knew, the threat reporting, this was the Super Bowl for ISIS-K, and they've been trying to kill Americans for a long time, but we've been pretty good on force protection, and they haven't been able to execute such a high profile attack against Americans. Again, they killed a lot of people while I was in Kabul. I was literally taking off one day from the airport, the same airport, and I saw a huge plume of smoke from an explosion that targeted a Shiite minority community of civilians, of girls at a school. They were able to kill a lot of people, but they weren't able to kill Americans at this number. But again, I think this is to the bravery of the US military, to the diplomats. They knew they were going into this, into this environment. And I can't know what was going through their heads, but they knew the risk, the threat reporting. They saw the intelligence. And then, my heart and my thoughts go out to them. A lot of the soldiers who survived, the Marines who survived that attack, survivors of it, they went back onto mission the next day. They went back to bring in more evacuees, more American civilians, more Afghan allies to bring them in. And so just the amount of integrity and dedication and patriotism those people have, those men and women. I mean, I'm just in awe of it. What could we have done better? I'm sure there's going to be some lessons learned from this, but I actually think that they took an appropriate amount of risk. That we can't have bloodless work and still be operating in these really high threat environments. And these things have costs and consequences. Again, I'm just really surprised that more people weren't killed, and particularly more Americans. I think that is nothing short. Again, horrifically tragic of the loss of our Marines, our sailor, and our Army colleagues and friends. But again, I think it's just remarkable that more weren't killed, given the risks they were taking and the feat that they pulled off of evacuating over this 100,000 plus people.
Alex, full disclosure, my two sons have served 4 tours over there. They weren't there at the same time as you were. What do you think of the US's working with the Taliban these last few days and the amount of information that apparently was turned over to them?
Yeah, so I mean, I thank your children on their service, and look, I mean, I had the privilege of working with both diplomats and military every single day on the ground for the time I was in Kabul in 2018, 2019. In terms of cooperation with the Taliban, I mean, I'm seeing the same reports and the same public reports you are. I think there is a pragmatic level of the Taliban provide security, and there's reporting that the Taliban offered to hand over Kabul to the U.S. and the U.S. said we can't take it over, and so the Taliban came in to provide security. I don't trust the Taliban. I think that they do a great job of saying one thing and doing something else, and I think their treatment of women, their treatment of minorities, their treatment of the freedoms and the gains made over the past 20 years are really in jeopardy, and I have really grave concerns about that. I don't think the military and intelligence and diplomatic professionals would do anything to harm Afghan partners, much less American citizens, in getting them out. I think, from the tactical perspective of sharing names or sharing lists, I have full good faith in U.S. Professionals, military and diplomats, to do the right thing and to make those exceedingly hard judgment calls in an incredibly high risk and high threat situation, to do what was best to try to get the most number of people out safely. And so that's all. I mean, I don't have any more inside information. I don't trust the Taliban. I'm concerned that they had access to those lists, but at the same time, I understand that they were used to get people out and for that exclusive purpose, in a very tactical and operational way. Not here's a list of everybody who's worked for the U.S. government, but here's 10 people on a bus that are coming in the next 15 minutes, let them through to get them out. Those are our people. Don't touch a hair on their head or else we will harm you. So that's my understanding of it, but I'm sure there's somewhere in the middle as well.
Just want to get your take.
Yeah,
thank you.
But again, I'm reading the same stuff you are. But again, I don't think there's no plot. There's nothing malicious from the U.S. government to hand over names to the Taliban.
No, I didn't.
Yeah,
I was not trying to portray that. I just wanted your take on it.
Sure.
Thank you.
No, pleasure. Thank you for the question.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that, Alex. I on behalf of our the Rotary Club of Lake Hickory, and I think we also have folks from the Rotary Club of Hickory and the Capitol Valley Rotary here as well. Just thank you for that. It was extremely informative. And
thank you all for your time.
Yeah.
Really helpful.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Al.
Great.
Well, thank you everybody for coming today. Are there any additional announcements for the good of Rotary this week?
David?
Yes,
I'd like
Dick.
to thank Jim Corral for setting this up. This has been a great program. Thank you, Jim.
Very welcome.
Thank you,
Jim,
Jim.
he's
This was great.
a great asset to America. Thank you for arranging the program.
Yes. Thank you, Nancy.
Thanks, Jim. This was great.
Very timely.
Yes, most certainly. Our next meeting is going to be September 7th. And we'll be via Zoom and also in person at the picnic shelter at Sanford Park. And at the meeting, Lee Young has the program. We're going to be hearing from Carol King with some of District Governor Ken Shull's fundraising efforts for the Rotary Foundation at the district level. They're doing some really cool fundraising efforts to try to raise $1 million for the Rotary Foundation coming from our district. Our greeter will be Alan Jackson, and Chris Cazell will have the invocation. And with that, let's adjourn with the four-way test. Of the things we think, say, and do, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? And will it be beneficial to all concerned?
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
That's a great program.
Great.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for including us visitors.
Thank you all for
Thank
coming.
you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Have
Take
a
it
great
easy.
week.